Okay, but into another episode of On the Wrist from Off the Cuff. Today I have a really cool comparison for you from the brand Traska. A little about them. They are headquartered out of Jacksonville Beach, Florida, and founded by a fellow named John Mack. And his intentions were to basically make a watch that you could wear every day without worrying about. A true tool watch that could really be fit for most any activity. And in this particular lineup, this is their Summiteer model, which does fall more under the everyday watch. So I feel like this is more, kind of that versatile blend of sporty and dressy attributes you look for, with a bit of kind of old school field watch flair, of course, all in the vein of the Rolex Explorer. I do have the first gen to compare to the fourth generation, and essentially this is just a refined blend of timeless design and modernity. The Summiteer brings the classic field watch into the 21st century, combining a vintage aesthetic and contemporary engineering. This formidable traveling companion is resistant to water, scratches, and shocks. You can get this for $615 direct, and it will be in stock and ready to ship as of August 13th, 2023. So with all that said, let's go ahead, zoom the camera out, get these pieces in hand, and take a closer look. Okay guys, so first off, this is the piece that you're going to be able to get today, and hopefully you're able to snag one because it is truly impressive. I will say that I just love this model. I loved it from the first gen, as you can see. I still have it. And the fourth gen really just goes above and beyond and takes it to new heights. But since this is the model that is going to be readily available, let's talk about some of those specs. 38.5 millimeters in diameter, with a 10.6 millimeter thickness that does include the crystal, and it's only 45.7 millimeters lug to lug, and it is 316L stainless steel with a scratch resistant hard coating that adds another 1000 Vickers from the hardness scale. It is brushed with finely polished chamfers, and it does also have drilled lugs. And one thing you'll also notice is that hard coating, which, you know, hey, 316L stainless steel normally is only around 200 hardness Vickers. With that added up, it's 1200. Now, this is the previous coating, and as you can see, it definitely had more of a hue to it, a darker, maybe even bronze-like tone. Of course, if you see it on its own, it still looks steel. It's great. It just has almost a titanium-like tint of darkness, which you can see here. The newest iteration of that hard coating is much clearer and crisper and brighter, which I really like. Another thing off the bat that you guys are going to notice is the crystal. So it used to have a flat crystal, still quite thin, but now, because they saved some millimeters from foregoing a display case back, putting a solid case back, they've gotten extra thinness, and with that extra thinness, they've been able to take a little bit more space and add this beautiful box dome sapphire, which actually does also do another thing besides it looking great. It actually does a cool job of shrinking down the dial a little bit. Check that out. So again, with that, it still has that same footprint at the 38.5, but now it actually has a smaller appearance and a smaller dial, which a lot of people are going to appreciate. So for me, I was really surprised when they came out with this in 2 sizes, because now it's also offered in a 36. But I think the changes made to the 38.5 are going to make a lot of folks happy. So if you thought that this wore a little large, which maybe it did in a way just because it had a pretty large expansive dial, you can see here everything's a little bit more centered. Some other key things that jump out, guys, you're getting here printed, very nice, you know, the lume and everything still, but now check that out. 3D applied lume markers all the way around, and you're still getting, of course, that center sunken in section, which gives you a bit of a, you know, a kind of a 3D effect there that almost acts as a sector dial, as you can kind of break the dial into different segments. The blues are still, you know, pretty close. They might even be the same Pantone, but I will say that the newer model does feel just a touch brighter. They both still definitely feel like navy blue, but I'll say that the new model, let me give it a quick little wipe to the crystal there. The blue feels just a touch more vibrant, not retro 70s, you know, bright Pelagos blue, but I think it's a slightly more pop of blue, right? Versus here in certain angles, even, you know, even under the studio lights, this is going to appear black sometimes. I think what they did here, although it's going to appear darker, it's going to render more as a blue or midnight blue depending on the lighting situation, versus here at times, you know, especially at distance, this could definitely pass a little bit more for black at times, but you know, that might just be my eyes. But you can see there still very similar. Some things changed, of course. Went from Traska automatic Summiteer to now just Traska and automatic with Summiteer not on the dial. Also some items, check this out there, the N-Link, now beautifully 3D milled. It wasn't bad before, also, you know, but it's improved now. Also the general case shape, while many, you know, micro brands and factory brands are putting out pieces like this, that, you know, by no means is this a bad, again, I love the watch as is, but there's so much added refinement now. So instead of just having a high polished bevel, which kind of everybody does now, you're gonna get the beautifully rounded kind of oyster-like case there with the bevel still, and then you're also getting a huge improvement on the design on that crown, which tactile engagement was good, but again, quite simple by comparison, and you're just getting something that feels a little bit more thought out, more refined, and more complete, which I really do like. Also, these links, they went from a 3-link fixed position, right, where it's basically going to be kind of fixed in that kind of Y shape. Here, these are individually articulated now, so it's going to actually drape much nicer. As you can see, if you wanted to try to stack this, you could. And there you go. So now it's going to be able to drape and wrap around your wrist much more comfortably. Also be more flexible as you're taking it on and off the wrist. You already had a nice little platform here with, of course, the nice perlage on the buckle before. It wasn't bad, and it still had quite useful micro adjust positions, but now you're just getting something more robust, more contoured, more luxurious. Check that out. Now it's high polish. Before, this was mainly brushed. You can see the sides are brushed. Here, brushed you know, tops, and then polished sides it runs through. Also, you're still getting that beautiful bevel, which is great, but it's just a bit thicker in terms of its construction, and not in a way that feels overly stout. Definitely just feels more robust. Check out the buttons, the push buttons on there versus before. You know, this was kind of just bent and you know, from flat pieces and everything, where this just has more of that milled aspect, which does add an extra feeling of security. But there is a slight amount of thickness, it looks like was picked up. It might just be the visuals and the way things lay, but by no means is it, again, overly thick. So again, it's just kind of all the way around, everywhere you look at, when you look at this watch, it just got better in so many ways. So with that said, let's actually get these pieces on wrist and see how they wear. Okay guys, as you can see on my 7.5-inch wrist, this 38.5 really hits a beautiful sweet spot, lays beautifully flat. Those curves are fantastic. You can see that high polish just helps melt away a lot of that visual weight. So even though you do have, again, even with that high crystal, which brings it in still to just 10.6 millimeters. Without that, I would say that it would appear much thinner, but you can see it's very clear that that is the protruding crystal. So I think your mind can kind of reconcile that, and it doesn't feel high at all. My gosh, that's gorgeous. But comparatively, check this out. Now, same diameter, but just with that flat crystal and that more expansive dial, it just wears a bit larger, right? Like it feels, I'd say, more like a 39 in its appearance, especially when you look at the more flat dial there, where you're not going to get to the 3D markers. Still war grade. I mean, I still really enjoy this piece. It's just quite simple by comparison, and some of you might really like that. But I will say again, the added refinement can't go unnoticed here, guys. It's just like they turned up so many things, not even things people complained about, and they just did more work to really differentiate their case, their bracelets, their dial. There's just average silhouette from so many of, I would say, the more cookie cutter iterations of, you know, these types of watches that have become very popular as kind of that go anywhere, do anything, one watch market has really exploded. I would say it's almost as popular now as the dive watch market, right? Like if it used to be before, if you had a micro brand, you had a diver. Now it's if you have a micro brand, you kind of have an adventure watch as well within that same category. And I gotta say, this thing looks great. So of course, if I do get my wrist too close to the camera lens, you're going to get a bit of perspective distortion, and this might seem a bit larger than it is on wrist. But actually, let me give it a quick little spritz here, because there's some dust. What I'll do is I'll leave my wrist nice and low and then just tighten up the frame here so you guys can get a bit more of a, you know, still a detailed, but just a truer aspect ratio on how centered this will sit on the wrist. That 45.7 millimeter lug to lug is fantastic. Look at that. And although I do have a 7.5 inch wrist, it's not particularly flat and wide. It's actually quite round. So, you know, even me, you know, I do have to, even though I do have a larger wrist, I do have to be considerate in terms of longer lug to lugs and how well they're going to suit my wrist. And I'll say this just hits such a sweet spot, and I can't really argue with how well balanced this is. I mean, it's just a real beauty. So with that said, let's actually get this off the wrist, set up for some loom shots, low light transition, and closing thoughts. Okay, let's go ahead and hit the lights here. Oh yes, check that out. That loom is absolutely beautiful, and although it was pretty nice in the previous iteration here, let me see that. You can see by comparison, definitely it takes advantage of that 3D loom applique. It's just, whew, it's pretty breathtaking, guys. And I know you don't necessarily need a lot of loom for a kind of field watch, but again, this within that do-it-all capability, it's just very impressive, and that effort shows. And I want to make sure that that doesn't go unnoticed in this little showcase. Now, one thing I always like to work in, of course, is a bit of low light transition, because you're not always going to be out in the middle of a field enjoying direct sunlight. A lot of times you're going to find yourself coming in and out of buildings, walking underneath overhangs, or maybe just hanging out underneath the shade of a tree. So it is nice to see what these colors, textures, and finishes render like in less than optimal lighting. So maybe even include some harsh lighting here that might expose any types of production defects, but you're just going to see how beautifully uniform the light glides over that nice brushing there. Beautifully done. I love the change on the brushing for that bezel. Went from that kind of more circular brush to this radial brush here, which holds the light in a different way, and it just looks gorgeous, guys. And then again, the loom is really bright, but if you get in kind of a mixed lighting condition, there's still plenty of contrast on this dial regardless of the lighting situation, which I love. So very, very functional, and just, again, it just hits so many of those points. And yeah, some of you might get carried away. All you see is a triangle and a 3, 6, and 9, and you're just saying, oh, well, that's just a very simple, Explorer homage. But hopefully, after seeing kind of the iterations and how this has evolved over time, you can see that this started out as something, I think a lot more pure, a lot more simple. And yes, it does pay homage to watches like the Rolex Explorer, but I think it's grown into something much more. It has its own personality. It's the 3D applied lume. I mean, this is the type of stuff that if Tudor was making this watch here, man, it would sell like hotcakes, just because it would have the name Tudor instead of the name Traska. So everything down to the screws and the screw links have just been improved, and it's pretty wild, guys. So closing thoughts on the wrist: perfect proportions, very comfortable, balanced wear. That hard coating is so much less noticeable visually than in previous generations. I mean, it's just impressive. And of course, it's still quite scratch resistant, which is great. It's still the same amount of hardness. I have other videos of me trying to scratch the stuff with a spring bar tool, and it just held up. So really, really nice to see something like that, where it's just, you are getting the functionality, but it doesn't get in the way in the form factor at all. So in terms of model variants, there's a charcoal black dial, a sage green dial. This is the midnight blue dial model, and then there's also a yellow sandstone model. So a lot of different options there. In terms of comparable models, this is kind of Tudor Ranger meets Black Bay 36 meets Monta Triumph. Honestly, like, it has a lot going for it, and it's cheaper significantly than all of those models, and it still adds things like that hardened coating that isn't really seen in those other models that may be more expensive. And it still has, of course, that great steel construction, still has a beautiful sapphire crystal with anti-reflective coating, and you're just getting something that's been really thought out and is quite beautiful, quite timeless. Some might find it quite boring, but I will say, if you pay attention to those finer details, you'll really be able to appreciate what this watch has to offer. So bottom line for me, Jon and Traska have refined the Summiteer from, a pretty no-nonsense everyday field watch into a really luxury-like adventure piece that can impress equally, whether on the summit or back at your local headquarters. I do really believe that. So let me know what you all think in the comments below. If you like the video, please do a like, and if you haven't already, please subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks, guys.